The sun rises over the Pacific Ocean, February 1943. On a heavily fortified island called Rabaul, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers stand ready, manning 5 airfields and 300 anti-aircraft guns. Their commanders expect the Americans any day now. But the invasion never comes. Instead, American ships sail right past. The Japanese watch, bewildered, as the fleet disappears toward less defended islands. They don't know it yet, but they've just become victims of the most brilliant military strategy of World War II, one that would doom them to isolation, starvation, and irrelevance. Welcome to the untold story of island hopping, the revolutionary American strategy that crushed Japan's Pacific Empire without firing a shot at some of its strongest fortresses. This is the tale of how Generals Douglas MacArthur and Chester Nimitz turned conventional warfare on its head, leaving over 300,000 enemy soldiers stranded on bypassed islands while American forces leapfrogged toward Tokyo. If you're fascinated by military strategy and hidden histories, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which World War II operation you'd like to explore next. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States executed one of history's most audacious military campaigns. Rather than attacking every Japanese stronghold head-on, they chose to bypass heavily fortified islands like Rabaul and Truk, leaving massive garrisons to wither on the vine, while American forces captured lightly defended strategic positions. Each captured island became a new airbase, extending American reach deeper into Japanese territory. The Japanese never saw it coming. Their entire defensive strategy relied on the assumption that Americans would fight for every island. Instead, American commanders played a deadly game of hopscotch across the Pacific, isolating enemy bases and cutting their supply lines. By the time Japan realized what was happening, it was too late. Their strongest fortresses had become prisons for their own troops. This is the story of how America won the Pacific War, not by being stronger everywhere, but by being smarter about where to fight. To understand the genius of island hopping, we must first grasp the impossible challenge facing America in 1942. After Pearl Harbor devastated the Pacific Fleet, Japan controlled a vast maritime empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands off Alaska to the Philippines, from the Carolina Islands to the Solomon Islands. The rising sun flag flew over thousands of miles of ocean and hundreds of fortified positions. The Japanese had transformed their captured islands into formidable fortresses. At Rabaul alone, they'd built 5 interconnected airfields with protected revetments for over 400 aircraft. They'd dug miles of underground tunnels and installed massive coastal defense guns. Simpson Harbor became a major naval base, constantly patrolled by destroyers and submarines. Similar fortifications existed at Truk in the Carolina Islands, nicknamed the Gibraltar of the Pacific. American military planners faced a brutal calculation. If they attacked every Japanese stronghold directly, casualties would be catastrophic. Intelligence estimates suggested that assaulting Rabaul alone could cost 50,000 American lives. With dozens of such fortresses scattered across the Pacific, a conventional island-by-island campaign could drag on for years and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. General Douglas MacArthur commanded Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, while Admiral Chester Nimitz led operations in the Central Pacific. These two very different commanders initially disagreed on strategy. MacArthur favored a land-based approach through New Guinea, partly to fulfill his famous promise, "I shall return." Nimitz advocated a naval campaign through the Central Pacific atolls. But by early 1943, both men recognized that direct assault on every fortified position was unsustainable. The solution emerged from an unlikely place: old American war plans.
As far back as 1911, Rear Admiral Raymond Rogers had drafted War Plan Orange, which included an island-hopping approach to reach Japan. This decades-old concept would be dusted off, modernized, and transformed into the strategy that would win the Pacific War. The stage was set for a revolution in military thinking.
The turning point came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway, where American forces sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and killed hundreds of their most experienced pilots. Japan's advance halted. For the first time, American commanders could think offensively. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning a brutal 6-month campaign. The battle for this single island cost over 7,000 American casualties and revealed a terrifying reality. Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical determination, preferring death to surrender. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi later called Guadalcanal the graveyard of the Japanese army. The Guadalcanal experience taught American planners a crucial lesson. Frontal assaults against entrenched Japanese positions were extraordinarily costly. As forces under Admiral William Bull Halsey fought their way through the Solomons, while MacArthur's troops advanced along the northern coast of Papua New Guinea, military strategists searched for a better approach. The breakthrough came in early 1943 during planning for Operation Cartwheel, a 2-pronged assault designed to capture or neutralize Rabaul. As staff officers studied maps and casualty projections, someone posed a radical question. What if we didn't attack Rabaul at all? The idea seemed insane at first. Rabaul was the linchpin of Japanese defenses in the South Pacific, home to over 100,000 troops and 5 major airfields. How could you advance toward Japan while leaving such a powerful base in your rear? But as planners examined the proposal more closely, they realized its brilliance. American submarines and aircraft could blockade Rabaul, cutting it off from supplies and reinforcements. Meanwhile, Allied forces could capture less defended islands nearby, building their own airfields to dominate the skies. Those isolated Japanese troops, no matter how numerous or well-armed, couldn't stop the American advance if they couldn't reach it. They would be strategically irrelevant, stranded on their island fortress with nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait. The concept of hitting them where they ain't was born. In April 1943, General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey met to formalize their revolutionary strategy. On April 26, they laid out Operation Cartwheel, a coordinated offensive codenamed after the acrobatic move, implying the rolling, circular nature of their 2-pronged advance. The plan was elegant in its audacity. MacArthur would advance along the northern coast of New Guinea, while Halsey drove north through the Solomon Islands. Like 2 arms of a pincer, they would encircle Rabaul from opposite directions. But they wouldn't actually attack the fortress itself. Instead, they'd established a ring of bases around it, cutting it off from the rest of the Japanese Empire. Operation Cartwheel officially launched on June 30, 1943, with simultaneous operations across multiple islands. Allied forces landed on Woodlark and Kirawina Islands, both undefended, and immediately began constructing airfields. These bases extended Allied air power's reach, allowing fighters and bombers to strike deeper into Japanese territory. Meanwhile, the battle for New Georgia Island revealed both the strategy's promise and its challenges. Defended by 10,000 Japanese troops who had constructed an airfield at Munda Point, New Georgia cost over 1,000 American lives and 4,000 wounded in brutal jungle fighting. The high casualties reinforced the wisdom of bypassing heavily defended positions whenever possible. The real test came in August 1943 at the Quebec Conference, where Allied leaders met to coordinate global strategy. British delegation members questioned the need for 2 separate Pacific offensives, concerned about diverting resources from the European theater.
But American planners had numbers on their side. Bypassing fortified positions would save both time and lives. The Joint Chiefs of Staff made a historic decision. Rather than assault Rabaul directly, Allied forces would isolate it through air and naval power while advancing past it toward more strategically valuable targets. General George C. Marshall and the combined chiefs approved the bypass strategy over MacArthur's initial objections. Ironically, MacArthur would later claim credit for inventing the approach. The revolution in Pacific warfare had official blessing. Now came the hard part, making it work.
The effectiveness of island hopping depended on three critical elements: air superiority, intelligence, and amphibious capability. Without all three working in concert, the strategy would collapse. Air power proved decisive. In August 1943, Allied codebreakers intercepted Japanese messages revealing plans to reinforce New Guinea with hundreds of aircraft at Wewak Airfield. Armed with this intelligence, MacArthur's 5th Air Force struck immediately, destroying over 200 Japanese planes on the ground shortly after they arrived. With unchallenged air supremacy established, Allied bombers systematically demolished Rabaul's 5 airfields and turned Simpson Harbor into a graveyard of Japanese ships. By November 1943, carrier-based aircraft from USS Saratoga and USS Princeton launched devastating raids on Rabaul. 6 of 7 Japanese cruisers were damaged, 4 heavily. According to historian Eric Larrabee, thereafter no Japanese heavy ships ever came to Rabaul. The island that once anchored Japan's Pacific defense was being neutralized without a single American soldier setting foot on its beaches. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was devastating. Pilots flying into what became known as the Bismarck sinkhole faced overwhelming odds. Between 70 and 120 Japanese aircraft managed to flee Rabaul for truck on February 19, 1944. When their mechanics attempted to escape by ship 2 days later, Allied bombers sank the Kokai Maru with all hands. Rabaul's offensive capability was finished. Meanwhile, MacArthur's forces advanced through New Guinea using the same strategy. Rather than attack the heavily defended Japanese base at Salamaya, Australian commander Thomas Blamey bypassed it entirely and proceeded directly to Lae. The isolated garrison at Salamaya, unable to retreat or receive supplies, withered in place. By March 1944, Operation Cartwheel had achieved its objectives. Rabaul was completely isolated, surrounded by Allied bases on Bougainville, the Admiralty Islands, and Amero. 100,000 Japanese soldiers remained trapped there, consuming dwindling food supplies and fighting occasional skirmishes with Australian forces, but contributing nothing to Japan's defense. The strategy had worked. Now it was time to scale it up. With Rabaul neutralized, Admiral Nimitz launched his Central Pacific campaign, applying island hopping principles on an even grander scale. His target? The Japanese-held atolls of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, stepping stones toward Japan itself. In November 1943, American forces assaulted Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The battle became legendary for its ferocity. Japanese commander Admiral Keiji Shibasaki boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He was catastrophically wrong, but the battle's cost shocked American planners. Over 3 days of savage combat, 5,600 Marines stormed beaches defended by highly trained Japanese troops in concrete bunkers and pillboxes. The Marines prevailed, but at a terrible price: 1,000 killed and 3,000 wounded. Nearly all 4,800 Japanese defenders fought to the death. Only 17 surrendered. Tarawa taught American forces crucial lessons about amphibious assault tactics and demonstrated the value of new weapons like flamethrowers for clearing fortified positions. But more importantly, it reinforced the wisdom of the island hopping strategy. If lightly defended Tarawa cost this dearly, imagine the casualties from attacking a fortress like Truk. In February 1944, Nimitz faced a crucial decision.
Truk Atoll, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, housed the main Japanese naval base with extensive facilities and a garrison of 12,000 troops. Pre-war intelligence had exaggerated its defenses, and American planners feared another Tarawa-style bloodbath. Admiral Raymond Spruance proposed a daring alternative. Rather than invade Truk, strike it with carrier-based aircraft in a massive raid, then bypass it entirely. On February 17–18, 1944, Operation Hailstone unleashed fury on Truk. Over 2 days, American carrier planes flew 1,250 sorties, sinking 40 Japanese ships and destroying 270 aircraft. The raid devastated Truk's offensive capability. Japanese forces withdrew their remaining aircraft and most naval vessels. Like Rabaul, Truk was reduced from a powerful base threatening Allied operations to an isolated garrison that could be safely ignored. The strategy's efficiency was undeniable. 2 mighty fortresses, Rabaul and Truk, neutralized without costly ground invasions.
As American forces leapfrogged westward, the campaign revealed an unexpected benefit. Captured Japanese documents and interrogation of rare prisoners provided invaluable intelligence about enemy positions and strength. This information helped planners identify which islands could be bypassed and which required capture. The Allied advance followed a carefully choreographed rhythm. First came reconnaissance flights to photograph and map potential targets. Then intelligence analysts assessed enemy strength, terrain, and strategic value. Finally, commanders decided capture or bypass. Islands selected for capture typically possessed 3 key features: light to moderate enemy garrison strength, strategic geographic position for airfield construction, and minimal natural defenses. Once captured, Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, worked around the clock building airstrips, fuel depots, and supply bases. What had been empty atolls transformed into forward operating bases within weeks. These new bases became launching points for the next leap. Heavy bombers struck targets hundreds of miles away, while fighters provided air cover for subsequent invasions. Each captured island extended American power deeper into Japanese-held territory, creating an unstoppable momentum. The strategy's mathematical elegance became apparent. Traditional warfare would have required capturing perhaps 100 islands to reach Japan. Island hopping required only 13 major amphibious operations. The time saved was equally dramatic. By bypassing fortified positions, American forces covered 1,500 miles in 18 months, an unprecedented pace in naval warfare. Japanese commanders recognized the strategy's brilliance too late to counter it effectively. In his post-war analysis, a senior Japanese intelligence officer praised American planning for its brilliance because it gained the most while losing the least. Another Japanese fleet commander admitted that what pained them most was the land-based air force stationed on forward islands, the very bases established on bypassed islands. By mid-1944, MacArthur's forces reached the Philippines, while Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive captured the Mariana Islands. From bases on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, America's new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach mainland Japan. The strategic encirclement was nearly complete. But the bloodiest battles still lay ahead. The closer American forces came to Japan's home islands, the more fanatical the resistance became. Japanese military doctrine emphasized death before dishonor, and soldiers internalized the concept that surrender meant eternal shame. This cultural mindset would turn the final island battles into nightmarish affairs. In June 1944, the Battle of Saipan demonstrated the new level of Japanese desperation. The island's civilian population had been taught that Americans were barbaric monsters who would torture and kill captives.
When defeat became inevitable, hundreds of Japanese civilians threw themselves off cliffs rather than face capture. American troops watched in horror as families jumped to their deaths holding their children. Saipan's fall triggered political earthquakes in Tokyo. The loss of the Marianas, so close to Japan that B-29 bombers could now strike the homeland, forced Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's resignation. Japanese knew the war was lost, but military culture and political pressures prevented surrender. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought concurrently with Saipan, resulted in the destruction of nearly Japan's entire carrier-based aircraft fleet. American pilots nicknamed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because Japanese planes fell from the sky like game birds. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed against minimal American losses. Japan's naval aviation would never recover. In October 1944, MacArthur fulfilled his promise, wading ashore at Leyte in the Philippines and declaring, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The subsequent liberation campaign would kill 80% of the 250,000 Japanese defenders. But more significantly, it isolated Japan from its conquered territories in Southeast Asia, cutting off vital oil and rubber supplies. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, history's largest naval battle, saw the last meaningful deployment of Japanese surface forces. American ships decimated the Japanese fleet, forcing Japan to resort to desperate tactics. On October 25, 1944, the first organized kamikaze attacks began, pilots deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. These suicide tactics revealed Japan's dire strategic position. With conventional forces depleted, they turned to sacrificing pilots in single-use attacks. The end was near, but the path would be soaked in blood. By early 1945, American military planners faced a grim dilemma. Island hopping had brought forces to Japan's doorstep, but the final approach required capturing two heavily defended islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Both battles would test the limits of American resolve. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island just 8 square miles, sat halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo. Its 3 airfields made it invaluable for escorting bombers to Japan and providing emergency landing sites for damaged aircraft returning from raids. But the island was also part of the Japanese homeland, the first piece of ancestral territory Americans would attack. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded Iwo Jima's defense. Unlike many Japanese commanders who preferred suicidal banzai charges, Kuribayashi was a strategic genius. He transformed the island into a nightmare honeycomb of tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery positions. The 11 miles of underground passages connected fighting positions that could survive massive bombardment. On February 19, 1945, 70,000 Marines stormed ashore after what they believed was a devastating naval bombardment. Instead, the hidden defenses survived virtually intact. As Marines crossed the beaches, Kuribayashi's 21,000 defenders opened fire from concealed positions. The volcanic sand made movement torturous. Men sank to their ankles with every step, while machine gun fire and mortar shells rained down. The battle lasted 36 days of cave-by-cave, tunnel-by-tunnel fighting. Marines used flamethrowers and explosives to clear each position, often sealing defenders inside their bunkers. The carnage was unprecedented in Pacific warfare. 6,821 Americans killed and 19,207 wounded. Over 20,000 Japanese defenders died. Only 1,083 survived to surrender. Marine Corps photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the most famous image of World War II atop Mount Suribachi: 6 Marines raising the American flag. The photograph would win the Pulitzer Prize and become an enduring symbol of American sacrifice. Admiral Chester Nimitz observed, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue." 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history.
If Iwo Jima was hell, Okinawa was the apocalypse. The invasion, codenamed Operation Iceberg, began on April 1, 1945, April Fool's Day. The initial landing was almost unopposed, lulling Americans into false hope. The Japanese had withdrawn to prepared defensive positions in the island's rugged interior, planning to bleed American forces white. Okinawa was different from previous island battles. Unlike Iwo Jima or Tarawa, Okinawa had a large indigenous civilian population, approximately 300,000 people caught between two armies. The Japanese military conscripted or impressed 40,000 Okinawan civilians into service, many of whom died in the fighting. The battle stretched for 82 days, making it the longest and bloodiest campaign in the Pacific. Japanese forces employed new tactics, the first massed kamikaze operations, with over 1,900 suicide aircraft attacks. These strikes sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 more, causing 4,900 American deaths at sea, nearly as many as died on land. The human cost was staggering. Of 117,000 Okinawan and Japanese troops defending the island, 94% died. American casualties exceeded 82,000, including 12,520 killed or missing and 38,000 wounded. An additional 33,000 Americans became non-battle casualties from combat fatigue, disease, and other illnesses. The psychological toll was immense. The constant artillery bombardment and kamikaze attacks led many to call it the Typhoon of Steel. Civilians suffered catastrophically. Between 42,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died, killed in crossfire, forced into suicide by Japanese propaganda, or executed by Japanese soldiers who suspected them of collaboration. American soldiers reported difficulty distinguishing civilians from combatants, leading to tragic mistakes. The legendary battleship Yamato, the world's largest, sorted for a suicide mission to support Okinawa's defense. American aircraft sank her on April 7th, killing 3,700 sailors, including Admiral Seiichi Ito. The vessel never reached Okinawa. As casualties mounted through April and May, American commanders faced a terrible realization. If Okinawa, still 340 miles from mainland Japan, cost this dearly, what would invading Japan itself demand? The casualty figures from Iwo Jima and Okinawa forced American planners to confront Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. Intelligence estimates predicted Japanese forces would mobilize 2 million defenders, including civilians trained to fight with bamboo spears. Casualties projections ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American dead. President Harry Truman, who had assumed office after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945, studied the actuary tables with growing alarm. Every week the war continued meant thousands more American lives lost to combat, kamikaze attacks, and the ongoing firebombing campaign against Japanese cities. American B-29 bombers had been systematically destroying Japanese urban centers since March 1945. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9–10 killed an estimated 100,000 civilians and left over 1 million homeless. Similar raids devastated Osaka, Kobe, and other cities. American leaflets dropped before raids warned civilians to evacuate, but Japan's government ordered citizens to remain and fight. Despite the devastation, Japan showed no signs of surrender. The military government preached 100 million will die together rather than accept defeat. Even after Germany's surrender in May 1945, Japanese leaders refused Allied demands for unconditional surrender. Then came July 16, 1945. In the desert at Alamogordo, New Mexico, the Manhattan Project scientists successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb, the Trinity test. The weapon's power exceeded all predictions.
Truman faced perhaps history's most consequential decision: use atomic weapons to force Japan's surrender or proceed with a conventional invasion that would cost countless lives. On July 26, Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if they refused. Japan's government, dominated by military hardliners, rejected the ultimatum. Premier Kantaro Suzuki used the word mokusatsu, to kill with silence, in dismissing the declaration. The die was cast. Truman authorized use of atomic weapons to end the war without invading Japan. What happened next would change human history forever.
At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The weapon detonated with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT, creating a fireball that reached temperatures exceeding 1 million degrees. The blast instantly vaporized everything within a half-mile radius and leveled 4 square miles of the city. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died immediately. Tens of thousands more would die from radiation poisoning in the following weeks. Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese government received reports of Hiroshima's destruction with shock and disbelief. They'd known American bombers could destroy cities. The firebombing campaign had proven that. But a single bomb causing such devastation exceeded imagination. Military officials struggled to understand what had happened. Still, Japan's Supreme War Council did not surrender. Military leaders argued they could endure atomic attacks just as they'd endured conventional bombing. They believed America possessed only one such weapon, and that Japanese determination could outlast American will. They were catastrophically wrong on both counts. On August 8, the Soviet Union, honoring its commitment to the Allies, declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with over 1 million troops. The lightning offensive shattered Japanese forces in China and Korea, ending any hope of negotiating a conditional peace through Soviet mediation. The next morning, August 9, another B-29 named Boxcar dropped a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. This plutonium weapon created similar devastation, killing an estimated 40,000 people immediately, with tens of thousands more dying later. 2 atomic bombs in 3 days shattered any illusions about continuing the war. Emperor Hirohito, breaking centuries of imperial precedent, personally intervened to end the deadlock in the Supreme War Council. In an unprecedented radio broadcast on August 15, 1945, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender to his subjects, many of whom had never heard his voice before. He stated the decision came because the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is incalculable. Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945, Victory in Japan Day, sparked wild celebrations across the Allied world. In American cities, people poured into streets, embracing strangers and weeping with relief. In Australia, Prime Minister Ben Chifley announced, "Fellow citizens, the war is over. The Japanese government has accepted the terms of surrender." But for soldiers fighting in places like Bougainville, New Guinea, and the Philippines, the reaction was more subdued. Lance Corporal Peter Medcalf, a 19-year-old rifleman on Bougainville, recalled, "Strangely, no one laughed or cheered. All afternoon we sat quietly and speculated. We found it hard to understand fully." The formal surrender ceremony occurred on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided as Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender. MacArthur's words captured the moment's gravity. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." The effectiveness of island hopping became undeniable in the war's aftermath. The strategy had isolated or neutralized 127 Japanese bases while covering 1,500 miles in less than 3 years. Most remarkably, it accomplished this while reducing Allied casualties by an estimated 60% compared to what direct assault tactics would have cost. Some 300,000 Japanese troops had been stranded on bypassed islands throughout the Pacific. Many continued fighting local resistance forces or Australian garrison troops for months after Japan's surrender. At Rabaul, approximately 69,000 Japanese survivors finally laid down arms, having spent over a year isolated and forgotten while the war raged elsewhere. Some bypassed garrisons never learned the war had ended. The most famous case was Lieutenant Hiro Onada, who continued fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, nearly 30 years after Japan's surrender, because he never received orders to stand down. The island-hopping strategy had not just won a war, it had revolutionized amphibious warfare. The aftermath of island hopping revealed the strategy's true scope. Of the 350,000 Japanese troops bypassed in New Guinea, New Britain, and New Ireland, only half survived to return home. The remainder died from disease, starvation, and occasional fighting with Allied forces left to contain them. On some islands, Japanese soldiers turned to desperate measures, hunting local wildlife and cultivating small gardens. But without supply ships, malnutrition and tropical diseases took a terrible toll. Australian forces assumed responsibility for containing many bypassed Japanese garrisons after American forces advanced westward. These containment operations continued until war's end, with occasional fierce fighting. On Bougainville, between 12,000 and 25,000 Japanese troops mounted a fierce resistance against Australian forces from December 1944 through August 1945. The human cost of the entire Pacific War defied comprehension. American forces suffered approximately 161,000 killed and over 250,000 wounded. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Over 2.1 million military deaths and hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. The atomic bombings alone killed between 110,000 and 210,000 people immediately, with many more dying from radiation effects. Island hopping's efficiency was demonstrated by comparing the bypassed fortresses to battles actually fought. Rabaul's 110,000-man garrison, which American planners estimated would cost 50,000 casualties to capture, was neutralized through air power and isolation at the cost of only aircraft and ships lost in bombing raids. Meanwhile, the relatively smaller but heavily defended Iwo Jima cost over 26,000 American casualties in direct assault. The strategy's influence extended far beyond World War II. Military strategists worldwide studied the campaign, incorporating its principles into modern amphibious warfare doctrine. The concept of bypassing strongpoints while isolating them influenced Cold War strategy and continues informing modern military planning. Perhaps most significantly, island hopping demonstrated that superior technology, intelligence, and strategic thinking could overcome numerical disadvantage and fortified positions. American forces didn't need to be stronger everywhere. They needed to be smarter about choosing where to apply force and where to simply deny the enemy the ability to fight effectively. 79 years after the last gun fell silent in the Pacific, island hopping remains one of history's most brilliant military strategies. The campaign's architects, MacArthur, Nimitz, and Halsey, proved that audacious thinking could save countless lives while achieving strategic objectives faster than conventional approaches. The strategy's legacy echoes through modern military doctrine. Today's concepts of anti-access/area denial, distributed operations, and bypassing strongpoints all trace lineage to decisions made in 1943 by commanders facing an impossibly fortified enemy across thousands of miles of ocean. The fundamental principle remains unchanged: impose your will by denying the enemy the fight they've prepared for. But island hopping's story also carries sobering lessons about war's human cost. The strategy saved American lives by avoiding direct assault on fortified positions, yet it still claimed tens of thousands of casualties in necessary battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. For Japanese forces left to wither on the vine, isolation meant slow death from starvation and disease. For civilians caught in the combat zones, the consequences were often tragic beyond measure. The strategy accelerated Japan's defeat, potentially saving lives by shortening the war. Yet it also enabled the conditions that led to atomic weapons use. American bombers flew from island-hopping bases to drop the bombs that ended the war. History rarely offers simple moral clarity. What remains indisputable is island hopping's effectiveness. By thinking differently about how to project power across vast distances, American strategists found a path to victory that seemed impossible after Pearl Harbor. They proved that the strongest fortress becomes irrelevant if you can simply go around it, that the largest garrison is useless if it can't reach the battle, and that sometimes the boldest strategy is to refuse the fight your enemy expects. The bypassed fortresses of Rabaul and Truk, once mighty anchors of Japanese power, became forgotten backwaters where soldiers withered in isolation while war swept past them toward its conclusion. They never saw the strategy coming, and by the time they understood what was happening, they were already irrelevant. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical or documented sources.